Hello and welcome back, my friend. Well, this is part 9 of the course. In this section, we're going to jump in and talk about everybody's fun subject when we're looking at industry standards and regulations, which, again, probably aren't the most fun and exciting things to talk about. And at the same time, they're a great place to look, especially if you're starting to learn about industrial cybersecurity. So I, I wish I had started to look at them before. I think when I initially started to get into industrial cybersecurity, it would have been one of those things that had shortened my initial path, which is why I want to share them today. Plus, they become important depending on the environments that you work in today or that you might work in down the road. So you might have some type of regulatory compliance that you have to be compliant with, like NERC CIP. So if you're in let's say a power plant in the United States or Canada or parts of Mexico, NERC CIP is going to apply. So you have to be compliant with it. So you have to understand those regulations, right? What does it require of your environment, right? To be from a security perspective. That's what we're going to talk about in this section. So I did have an extra disclaimer here, not here's the normal ones, but also this idea that if you ever have a question when it comes to compliance and is with we talk about regulatory requirements, right? There's a legal mandate, whether it's from your country's government, whether from like a federal government, like we have in the United States, at a state or maybe a province level, maybe it's at a municipality or a city level. The idea is you have different laws and different rules that you have to adhere to, even different industries. We're going to talk about some, like we're just mentioning NERC CIP for power generation and transmission in North America. Right? You have different legal requirements. When you talk about anything regarding legal requirements, the only people that can answer your questions are lawyers. So I actually had a call not too long ago where it was a CISO, large company with a large industrial footprint, jumped on a call, and I was really surprised, and it was actually kind of a fun call because gentleman, we jumped on the phone call, and he mentioned, I was just talking with Rob Lee. We talk about Rob Lee all the time, over at Dragos and Sands, and he's like, I was just talking with Rob Lee, and he didn't have an answer to my question, but I was wondering if you did. So I kind of made me smile that I was his second choice after Rob Lee. And then he was asking a compliance requirement, and I told him you have to check with the lawyers. He's like, yeah, that's what Rob said. So it's, again, when it comes down to questions of are you conforming or are you meeting some type of legal requirement, only a lawyer can answer that. So just to put that out there. Again, I am not a lawyer, so. But I am here to, again, kind of walk through the different standards and regulations that we have out there. So we'll talk about really the differences between like standards and regulations, right? Or this idea kind of as best practices and suggestions versus things that you're legally required to do. And there's some great standards and frameworks out there. So we'll talk about, and we always talk about the ISA IEC 62443 standard, even though it's really it's a family or a set of standards. But we always talk about it as the gold standard of securing control system environments. We talk about NIST 882 as well. So very similar to 62443 in a lot of respects as far as trying to help explain how to build a cybersecurity management program for your OT environment. They like the term OT these days. We do talk a little bit about ISO 27001, 27002. I have a lot of experience, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it from an IT perspective. So it does have some use in the OT world. So that's why I did want to mention it here, especially the main focus in ISO that a lot of people forget about is this idea of continual improvement. A lot of times we implement security controls to become, quote unquote, compliant with some type of regulation, and then we don't do anything for years. We're not changing, we're not improving, while the attackers are out there. They're continually changing and evolving and improving. So that's why I do want to talk about ISO for at least a few minutes. So I mentioned NERC CIP earlier, and for folks in that work in power, especially generation and transmission in North America. We'll talk about CFATS, so for chemical environments. This is one I don't have as much experience in directly, so this was a little bit more of a learning experience for me, which I was glad to take. And then the TSA Security Directives, which I do have a lot of experience with when we talk about there's new regulations or requirements for pipeline operators and in the wake of Colonial Pipeline. And not just pipeline operators, but they also added rail transit because if your pipelines go down, your backup to be able to move large amounts of things like gasoline across the country, it's going to be rail. So we want to protect pipelines and rail at the same time. So those are the ones we're going to talk about throughout this section, right? This part of the course. And there's some other kind of little ones out there. I kind of use a general term. We'll wrap up with as well in the section. So we talk about standards, right? The standards are, and this is again one of the main differences between when we talk about standards versus regulations. Remember, regulations, which we're going to get into, those are legal requirements. You have a government, some type of entity telling you must adhere to these rules, right? You must follow the speed limit, right? You must stop at a stop sign. You run the stop sign, you get a ticket. Right? With industry standards, right? Standards are this idea of best practices, right? They're suggestions on things that you should do in your environment for cybersecurity to help protect your network. So it's these things that you should do. The nice thing is when you talk about industry standards, right? These are standard. They're these best practices and guidelines that are created by the industry. So in this case, whether it's by the cybersecurity industry, or you might have additional standards that come from maybe a specific sector, like when we talk about CFATS, right? Which is specific to chemicals. Or when we talk about, the TSA, even though those are, I guess, regulations. So maybe I'm jumping ahead, but the idea is you can actually have industry standards also for different sectors, like maybe oil and gas. So when we talk about the kind of industry groups, when talking about ICS and OT cybersecurity, we're always talking about ISA, so the International Society of Automation, even though they're based and headquartered out of the United States. And then also, it kind of, in a way, reports up to, in a way. We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship, but the International Electrotechnical Administration, or IEC. So that's why when you see 62443 listed anywhere, then you see it as ISA/IEC sometimes, or depending on where you live in the world. Like if you're in the United States, usually you'll refer to it as ISA. If you're in Europe and Asia, other parts, outside of North America, you usually see IEC. So when I see, especially like LinkedIn posts and people will mention ISA or IEC, one or the other, I know exactly, or I have a good idea of, the part of the world that they're from, at least. When I write it, I try to write both to make it all a little bit more encompassing. Right? So again, we'll talk about that relationship, but the idea is with like ISA and IEC 62443, again, it's a standard that's been created by people in the industry, right? We brought together engineers and cybersecurity professionals and automation professionals and PLC programmers and technicians and the people that do operations and maintenance in all types of different facilities around the world to create these standards. But there's no law that says you must adhere to ISA 62443. Again, there's suggestions, there are best practices that you can follow to improve cybersecurity. In this case, you can use it to create a full-fledged cybersecurity management program for your OT environment. It's one of the biggest questions I get today, usually. So there's three main standards that we're going to talk about, really two, right? For ICS or OT environments, we talk about, again, ISA IEC 62443, and then NIST 800-82. Remember, ISO 27001, 27002 is has a focus on IT cybersecurity. But again, there's nothing that says we can't take the good things that would apply to an OT environment. It's just not where you would take everything, right? Because IT and OT cybersecurity are just very different. They're very similar. So where we have those similarities, borrow from 27001 and 27002. Why not? Right? But where they're different, right, then we're not going to borrow, or we're going to adjust, or we're going to change something. But jumping back to ISA IEC 62443, again, we mentioned this is the gold standard of how we implement cybersecurity in a control system environment. Again, though, just keep in the back of your mind, it's not a single standard. It's a group of standards, and you'll see what I mean. And that's, I think, one of the what makes it confusing for people at first. So again, hold on, and we'll get to there. Right. But again, we mentioned it comes from ISA and IEC. It's kind of like this joint effort. But again, we're going to talk about it a little bit more in detail. Remember, NIST 800-82 comes from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, which is based out of the United States, and it is funded by the United States government. So I can understand why individuals outside of the United States or U.S. and Canada or North America might not look to it as strongly as they would something like ISA IEC 62443. Great thing about NIST 800-82, they do a really good job. It's a solid standard that it's free. ISA IEC 62443 is not, unfortunately. So you have this gold standard, but you're also going to have to pay for it. Or you're going to at least have to pay for a membership to ISA, and then you get access to, well, some of the standard for free, not the entire thing for free. So again, you'll see what I mean when we get there. Now, we also mentioned, remember, standards are suggestions for things that we can follow, right? These are things you can do to improve cybersecurity in your environment. Awesome. Now, you might also work in a particular environment where there's a legal requirement, right? There's a law that specifically states that you must do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, you could be fined. Potentially, somebody could go to prison. Perhaps your environment gets shut down by the government or some other type of legal entity. So when we have regulations, right, it's really important to understand in our environments what regulations apply to us, right? Which regulations we have to follow. Like I work at Floor, we're a publicly traded company. So from an IT perspective, right, we understand that we fall under SOX compliance, right? We have to comply with the Sarbanes-Oxley law or act. Really. So in the ICS/OT world, again, there's really not a lot of regulations. Honestly, there's more coming, as we see more and more cyber attacks against environments, especially in North America, where so much of our OT environments is privatized, right? It's not government owned; it's owned by individual entity or companies. And the idea is that, unfortunately, right, a lot of environments still aren't taking action to protect their environments against cyber attacks. And so when you kind of get to this tipping point where you have more successful attacks and there's that impact to society, then government will step in and they'll write regulations, well-meaning, at least they're well-meaning in the work, but sometimes the regulations don't always, really meet the true need. Sometimes regulations, if they're written by politicians or people that don't understand these environments, right, they could break the environment if you actually applied or you followed these requirements. So it's a really kind of interesting conversation to have, and it'll be interesting, to say the least, to see what types of regulations come out in the next couple of years, especially in the United States. Right? But the idea is that no matter your environment you work in, make sure, understand, do you have any regulatory requirements that you have to follow? Because those are going to be a top priority. You want to make sure that you're following those. You're following the letter of the law. Right? You don't want the organization in trouble. You don't want to get in trouble. Right? You don't want anybody going to jail. So understand the regulatory requirements. And again, it's very specific to different industries. There's not one kind of blanket regulatory requirement for OT networks. Or we'll mention NERC CIP, again, the big one. So power transmission, right? If you're generating electricity or you're transmitting it in North America, then you have to comply with NERC CIP. If you don't, and then they will levy heavy fines against your company. So we'll come back and talk again more about those regulations, right? So NERC CIP, again, CFATS was something that I didn't have a lot of direct interaction with. It's something that I always heard about, and in my day job at Fluor, we do some chemical work, but we don't do most of our chemical work in this is outside of the United States, where so CFATS is for chemical installations in the United States. And then talk about TSA, where most of my experience there, little from pipeline, but most of it comes from rail operators and working with light commuter rail or subways. So we'll talk about those. And again, there's other requirements out there. Again, you have to look at your specific industry, your specific sector, right? If you're in water, there are general requirements about how you're required to supply clean water to the general public. To be able to do that, there's this component of, well, we have to make sure that the plant is secure from cyber attacks. Because if an attacker was able to come in and change processes, right, would they be able to, put too much of one chemical in the water, or would they be able to, change the basically, what they shut down the water treatment facility, and then you have just dirty water going out to the general public, or what if they just shut down the plant? That just recently happened in Ireland. I think we mentioned in one of the previous sections. Right? You had 160 people that didn't have water for 120, or you had 160 people in Ireland that didn't have water for 2 days. Again, not the end of the world. But when we can exaggerate that out to, well, maybe it's 160 people for 2 months, or what if it's 160,000 people for 2 or 3 days? That's a big difference. Right? If you had 160 people all going to the store for bottled water, the infrastructure could support that. If you had 160,000 people going to the stores for bottled water, the infrastructure might not be able to handle that. Right? So again, be familiar with those standards and requirements that you have for your environments. Right? Again, they talk about a lot of them are very vague. They don't talk specifically to cybersecurity, or they'll just talk at a high level that you have to have cybersecurity, and that's it. There's no real details. But again, if for regulatory requirements, I guess I really should update the slide. For regulatory requirements, consult with a lawyer, right? And then if they know what they're talking about, they could also help you choose a standard. The nice thing is that if you're following a standard like ISA, IEC 62443, or NIST 882, then it can help you be compliant. Idea is if you have a, let's say, NIST 882 shop, and let's say you've implemented everything in the standard, then more than likely you're NERC CIP compliant, or you're probably 95% of the way there. I'm talking in generalizations because it's been a couple years since I took the NERC CIP class, and honestly, it's all auditing, so I'm not the biggest fan of auditing things. So again, we mentioned NIST. The great thing about NIST, I mentioned earlier, it's free, right? So again, I understand some people outside the United States, they don't want to adopt a standard that was sponsored by the United States government. So I can understand that. But again, it's a great reference. If anything, the great thing is if you go into the NIST document, which we're going to look at in a sec, the idea is that you can read just the first section or two to get a really good high level overview of industrial control cybersecurity. So again, this is what I was mentioning earlier was, if well, I guess it really didn't exist in its current form back then, but if you're on that journey today, right, take NIST, right, no matter what part of the world you're from, and read at least the first section or two. Right? It's like reading a great book on this is how cybersecurity works in industrial control environments. And you can see they just released version 3 about, I think this is 3 months ago at this point. So hot off the presses, right? So make sure that you want to go ahead and get a copy. Again, it's free to download the PDF, so it doesn't cost you anything. So why not? And then there's the download link you can see there. So if you go to the download link, or the main link for 800-82, again, we're on version 3 now. So the idea, and we can pull it up, and this is the document. You can see it's 316 pages. Now, a lot of that at the end, you can see is kind of how they break down all these different cybersecurity controls that you're going to apply in the environment. So this makes a great checklist, right? If you had it in like a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, right? How you're going to apply all of these different controls in your environment, right? So a lot of this is also described, in the main body of the document, right? Explaining to you what each of these means. But before I get too far ahead, right, the idea is what I mentioned earlier is if you download the document and you scroll through, you'll see the first part of it. You see, there's the executive summary, there's the introduction, but there's the OT overview, right? So about 30 pages talks really just at a high level of what industrial control cybersecurity is. And they have some pretty decent, diagrams in here. You can let's jump ahead and you can kind of see, and there's a few, right? Here's kind of the basic operation of a typical OT system, right? So really they're talking about the control or the closed loop right there, that we talked about before. Here you can start to see, some network infrastructure, right? So we start to get into things that kind of look like more of a physical perspective, rather than more logical of the Purdue model, right? So especially if we want to look at, like, remember SCADA and how industrial control systems talk over wide area links. What does that look like? So I think they do a really good job here. But let's jump back up to the top. An idea, if we're looking at the table of contents, this is how I kind of break it down. And this is how I broke down this section in the course, right? Because we've the rest of this course is the OT overview, so we don't need to go into that. But the main focus on why people look to standards is that they want to build, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. They want to build a formal cybersecurity program for their OT environments. And so here we have NIST saying this is how you do it. And honestly, and it's a much simpler, much more straightforward, maybe slightly less comprehensive than 62443. But it is much more straightforward and it's much more simpler, especially if you have no program today. And this is great to get up and running. And then you can kind of mature or move to 62443 as that next level. So we'll talk about how NIST talks about developing your cybersecurity program. How do we look at risk management, which is a key component to not only NIST, but all of 62443 is based around this idea of risk management, how we perform those risk assessments and then build out our security controls around the results of that assessment work. But we'll come back and talk about that. Right? Talk about cybersecurity architecture, which we've got into a lot in this course previously, but there's some other things that we haven't talked about. And then you can also see, since this is written by the United States government, they will tie it back into the cybersecurity framework, or CSF, you see sometimes. Right? That was work that was out of the administration, the Obama administration, on trying to simplify cybersecurity for companies and entities in the United States and elsewhere, but really to try to take this complex idea of cybersecurity that a lot of businesses just thought it was too complex to grasp or approach, and simplify it for them. And we had a lot of really great success with it, honestly. So let's go ahead and jump back to the slides. If I can get back there. Okay. So I do want to spend a few minutes going over those other parts of NIST 882. Again, we're not going to spend time on the OT overview. That's the rest of the course that we've done in the other first 8 parts. But again, a lot of people look to NIST as a way to start, how do I build a cybersecurity program for OT? A lot of times, I see a common example would be you have a CISO, right? Somebody from the IT world, right? And they are maybe have built a very strong cybersecurity program for their IT network, right? For the back office, but they haven't done anything for OT. And they're like, well, where do I start? What the heck do I do? That's, again, it's a great reason to look to NIST to help answer those questions. That's exactly what it was designed to. So they even talk about in the NIST document these 2 areas of establishing a charter and building the business case for the program in the first place. Now, I changed the order because they said, well, write your charter. I'm like, the charter, right, is basically this document, like a policy that says we are going to have a cybersecurity program for the OT network. Problem is, if Mike Holcomb writes a charter and just says, hey, we're going to have cybersecurity in, let's say, the power plant network. Who the heck is Mike Holcomb to say that, right? The idea is you need the highest level executive in the environment, usually the CEO, or in larger environments, it's typically going to be one of the CEO's direct reports that's going to provide their weight. They're going to authorize, they're going to put their weight behind that charter or that policy that says we are going to have a cybersecurity program for the environment. So then you have things like budget, right? Because you need resources, you need people, you need tools, you need time. The only way you're going to get that is by getting that authorization and that buy-in by executive leadership. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to establish the charter first, right? Because before we can have a charter or a policy that states we're going to have a cybersecurity program, well, we have to sell the business on why we need a cybersecurity program for the OT network. But I thought it was really great that they put that information. They said, hey, this is how you build the business case. So we talked to, right, our primary requirements of ensuring physical and environmental safety. And then third, of course, the availability of operations, because the reason that organization probably exists, it's centered around the OT network, right? What does that OT network do, right? Is it a manufacturing plant, right? Well, the manufacturing plant, right, it creates some type of product that the company sells to generate revenue. That's why the company exists. If it's a power plant, it generates electricity that we push out, right? We provide that electricity to the world around us, and of course the clients, right? The electricity users, they pay us, right? We generate revenue. So the whole reason why that power company exists, right, is not only to power the world, but to make money at the end of the day. So we want to focus on, yes, it's about ensuring physical environmental safety. But I think in the back of our minds, right, the business is, and I'm not trying to say they're not worried about people getting hurt or dying, right? I'm not trying to say that. But most conversations, right, are going to center on how do we keep operations up and running? And if a cyber attack or something as common like a ransomware attack now that's hit remember, over half of OT environments globally have had some type of impact from ransomware today. And that's just it's February of 2024 right now. And those attacks are only increasing. Remember, 75% of manufacturers in the UK have been hit by ransomware and impacted in some way, shape, or form. Those are great numbers to sell to the business, right? They're horrible to hear as cybersecurity professionals, but they're great numbers to use to sell to the business. I said, we're going to get hit. When we get hit, how prepared are we? If we don't have a program in place, if we don't have the security controls to reduce the risk and the impact of when we get hit, we're in trouble. If we go down for 10 days, right, the average time an environment will go down with the ransomware and OT. Doesn't matter how small, medium, large size you are, 10 days, like Colonial Pipeline, right, the Port of Nagoya and the Australian port, 10 days. Manufacturing fits 10 days. If we go down for 10 days, what's the impact to the business? Some operations, they'll shut down and that business will cease to exist. That's not what we want to have happen. I also have a big push when I talk about bringing in security controls, right? 99.99% of the time, it's not about finding an attacker in the environment. But what if it's about finding, operational and performance issues that we can work with the engineering team and the folks that do operations and maintenance and the technicians to improve the operations of the facility? That's a huge selling point to the business. Like, hey, we're going to help you make the plant run faster. The plant is going to be more efficient. So whatever we're generating or we're creating, we're going to be creating more of it much more quickly, much more efficiently. Now, a lot of projects that I get involved with from a floor perspective, right? We're building new facilities and there's all these different stakeholders, including like the general public, that have concerns. Like when we built the new New York Bridge, going over the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey, right? There were a lot of concerned citizens, especially those that lived in the area, about, what's going to happen when the bridge is being built over this 5, 6, 7, 8-year span, right? Or when we were building a large LNG plant for Shell up in Kitimat, up in the northern part of Canada, right? The local people that live there. Well, what would happen if that plant, where it was the tank that holds the liquid natural gas, exploded? What would be the impact to us? Are there safety issues that we have to be concerned with? Right, so there's a lot of concern from the general public that we have to be able to address. So when you look at from a cybersecurity perspective, right, we can look at, we're stepping up, right? We're keeping the environment or the plant secure to help keep people safe and the environment safe by increasing the level of cybersecurity in the environment. And we do that because we're following this standard. In this case, we talk about NIST 800-82. You can see it provides this foundation for compliance and governance, which means, I hate reading from this line, but what if down the road we do have to be compliant with a specific regulation? Again, more than likely, if we're NIST 882 compliant, we follow everything in the standard. Again, that not that we're required to, but if we follow everything, chances are, if there's a regulation that comes out, we're already going to be compliant, or we're going to have a little work to do, not a ton of work to do to become compliant with that regulation. You can see sometimes it can limit fallout if there's some type of legal case. Especially, this is one of those things. And again, I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go too deep into this. But you do have seen cases where it's almost even like when you get pulled over, and if, let's say, you run a stop sign accidentally because you didn't see it, right? If you explain to the officer, like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm new to the area. I was, looking around. Maybe I dropped my phone. I was looking for, directions, and I'm sorry, I didn't see the stop sign. They might take it easy on you and might not give you a ticket, or they might. Right? It's kind of up to them. It's the same thing I've seen in some cases. Again, I'm not a lawyer. Just in some cases I've seen, it seems like, okay, well, you've tried your best, right? You've implemented NIST 882 in your environment, so we're going to take it easy on you, right? You tried your best. And I think that's one thing that we see in cybersecurity a little bit more these days is some leniency. As long as you prove you've done your best, and not just your best, but you've come up to a higher standard than most organizations. Because I think people realize, again, we've had this conversation that no matter what environment, right? When you see the Microsofts of the world, right? And the Department of Defense and the NSA, right? The best of the best security teams in the world, and they get breached. It's like, what do the rest of us mere humans, right, have? Do we have a chance? No. So we want to be able to prove, though, that we've done the work, our due diligence, right? We put in the time, we put in the effort to make the environment as secure as we could with the resources provided, with the understanding, we're still going to get hit, but we're going to fight the good fight anyways. But we want to limit the damage. So if we can prove that, then I think that goes a long way. There's the idea that it could also lower your cybersecurity insurance premiums if you're following a standard. So that you would have to talk with, of course, the insurance companies about. And then I like this idea that it can act as a market differentiator in some cases. Not for all like OT environments, but say if you're a manufacturing facility, maybe you bring in clients and you manufacture like their own products for them. And so they would choose between different manufacturing facilities. And then you could say, well, I'm 882 or I'm ISA IEC 62443 certified, or say I follow those standards and our competitors don't. So you could kind of spin it as we're more secure than those other environments. So you should come work with us. Give us your business, right? That's the idea of acting as a market differentiator. So there's, again, how 882 talks about, I like how they, share this idea of here's how you build the business case. Here's how you work with your leadership to establish an OT cybersecurity program. Again, before they're going to give us the budget, we have to sell them on the benefits of doing so. And they're like, well, here's a checklist for all the things for you to talk with them about, which I think is awesome. Now, then we get into how do we build the program, right? So, and there's a lot to this, right? And we're just going to talk to it at a high level. But this idea of talking about what's your overall OT cybersecurity strategy? Well, to keep the OT environment from getting breached. Sure, we have that, but realistically, right, how are we going to start to build cybersecurity into the OT environment? And again, continually improve that over time. We talk about before cybersecurity can even exist in the environment. This is kind of where we're going back with that charter conversation. You have to have policies. Those policies have to be authorized by the highest level executive, leadership in the environment, because otherwise nobody's going to pay attention to them. If Mike Holcomb writes it, unless Mike Holcomb is the owner of the company or maybe the CISO or the CEO, nobody's going to listen. So we have to have those policies, right, that say this is what we're going to do. That you must do this. You must not do these things. Now, of course, if we're going to have a cybersecurity program, we have to have people that are trained for cybersecurity. When we talk about cross-functional, right? Because in our environments today, it's not just OT, right? It's also IT. And so it's this combined or this hybrid IT OT world that we live in. So we have to train our IT folks on cybersecurity and OT and even teach them about OT. Right? How does the OT environment work? And our OT folks, right, our engineers and automation team members and PLC programmers and technicians, the folks that do operations and maintenance, right? We have to teach them how to do cybersecurity. And that's a lot of work, right? That's why everybody's here in this course, especially if you've made it all the way through part 9. But we're not just talking about our technical team members. So we also have to do at least a base level of awareness training for all of our employees to help them understand their responsibilities in ensuring cybersecurity in the environment. So what about all the other plant workers? And again, I would say it's not just for OT. We talk about it on the IT side of the house as well. Now, one of the important security controls that we can always implement is looking at developing an incident response program. At a bare minimum, we need to be able to understand what's going to happen when we do detect an incident. How do we respond? How do we limit the damage? If we don't have an incident response plan, then the damage could be unlimited. Or in, let's say, Colonial Pipeline, right? It's a great case, right? Pipeline went down for 10 days. Took them 10 days at least to get the pipeline back up and running. If they had, I don't have any, I don't insider knowledge, and I don't work and never did work for Colonial Pipeline, but I would say they probably didn't really have well-developed incident response procedures. If they did, they could have probably reduced 10 days to a lot less. That's why incident response, having those capabilities, right? Having that plan in place, knowing what to do in the event of an incident, goes a long way in helping secure the environment. Because we know it's not a question of if, it's that question of when. That's why it's one of my top 5 cybersecurity controls for OT. We also want to make sure we have recovery and restoration, or right, we're backing up all of our data and we're backing up all of our config. So let's say if some reason we lost a PLC, and maybe it's not a cyber attack, we just lost the PLC for some strange, maybe the thing bricked for some strange reason. Maybe it shorted out and we had to replace the PLC. We want to be able to restore that initial functionality, right? The programming, and have it back up and running as quickly as possible. So again, another one of those important critical controls that we have in OT environments, just like in IT, right? It's just we want to back up everything so that way we can be able to restore it as quickly as possible and make sure we're testing those backups to make sure that we can restore them. Talk about developing a maintenance tracking capability. And there's a couple of reasons that we want to do this. But the idea is this is part of my master's thesis, so this is going to kind of be a presentation after this course is done, but this idea of we see changes being made in the environment. We want to make sure those changes are authorized, right? They went through a formal change management process and that it wasn't an attacker making changes. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind for now. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute, a couple of minutes. And then there's this idea of establishing a governance program. And this can take kind of different there's different approaches to this in different organizations, and sometimes people, also talk about compliance and governance, and depending on the environment, they could be one or very different things. But this idea of making sure you can have kind of more of the idea of compliance, where making sure, are we following all the requirements for 882 in the environment? Right? Are we complying with it? A lot of time when you see governance could also play into compliance, but also like with governance, a lot of times it's how do we work with other entities outside of our own organization for cybersecurity? So if I have a provider or a vendor, think especially a vendor that's going to have secure remote access into my OT network, how do we ensure they're secure? Or how do we ensure the applications that we're purchasing or the tools we're purchasing for use in the OT or the IT network, right? How do we ensure that those are as secure as possible? Right? That's also that idea of governance. There's a lot to be said there. So the next part of 800-82 talked about risk management, which is key to OT cybersecurity. Usually when you talk about any OT cybersecurity program, it always revolves around risk management, especially in ISA IEC 62443. So 800-82 does a good job at risk management, or a very good job. ISA IEC 62443 takes it to the next level. So, but I mentioned 800-82 is a great place to start if you have nothing for risk management today. So it's all about understanding security risk from an OT environment. So how do we ensure physical safety, environmental safety, availability of the environment, right? How do we be able to do a risk assessment to look at different aspects of the OT network and operations to understand what are the actual cybersecurity risks, right? What would happen if a ransomware infection got into the IT environment? What would the impact be to the OT network if the entire IT environment burned down from a ransomware infection? Then you look at the different aspects or the areas of the OT network. What would happen if an attacker got into this area, or what would happen if ransomware got into this environment? That's kind of that risk assessment process that you go through. We'll go into it in more detail in the 62443 section. Right? How do we respond, right? When we find a risk, maybe we realize, I'm trying to see something that I see probably many places. Maybe we realized during the risk assessment that we were looking at the access control list for the IT to OT DMZ firewalls and realized they weren't as restricted as they needed to be. And then, well, how do we respond? The nice thing in that case is more than likely we can eliminate that issue by making the change. In OT environments, though, and even in IT risk management, right, it's not always as easy, though, to eliminate all the risk by making a simple change. So once we've conducted risk assessments to understand the risks that are in the environment, and just because we have a risk assessment doesn't mean we found all the risks. We have to understand, there's things that we're not going to find, that we're not going to realize, right? That we're, the group of people working on that risk assessment are going to miss. So we don't get everything. It's like a pen test, right? A pen test doesn't catch everything. But let's jump in ahead. That's the next part, the final part in the course. But once we find we have a list of risks in the environment that we've identified and how we're going to address those, then we have to also monitor risk over time because, like I mentioned earlier, you're not able to fix every risk. It's not an easy thing to just to simply eliminate risk that we identify in the environment. And so a lot of times we might apply a cybersecurity control, but that's only going to lower the risk associated with that issue. I'm trying to think of like a common issue we see as far as maybe I have, let's say, a manufacturing environment. And in that manufacturing environment, I have say the MES, the manufacturing execution system. Right? It's the kind of think of the brains behind the operation, right? It coordinates all the manufacturing, all the pieces, telling them when to move and how much to make and when to make it and how to bring in all the different components that we bring together to make a product. And so the MES coordinates all of that activity, even then, telling the business, well, how much of the product have we created so we can do things like shipping logistics. So we have the MES. It's a mission critical asset. But we also understand a lot of those, they're Windows based systems, right? They're just Windows servers. So there's inherent risk with Windows systems or any system, right? So we understand that there are risks, like we're going to have to determine, are we going to deploy monthly security patches to this system or not? So a common conversation, even though it's not exciting, but a common conversation that comes up is, well, when Microsoft Patch Tuesday hits, how long are we going to wait to deploy patches? Because a lot of environments are concerned that Microsoft Patch Tuesday comes out, you start rolling out the patch automatically. But what if there's an issue with the patch? And that happens every once in a while, like once a year or so. I would say you hear about different environments having issues with patches and they're getting blue screens of death on their systems. Not what we want to have happen in IT, definitely not what we want to have in OT, and definitely not on that manufacturing execution system that's central to our operations. So that would be a risk that we would want to track over time, understanding we're not going to deploy Microsoft patches on Patch Tuesday. We're going to wait maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. Now we can lower that risk. Maybe we implement a secondary MES, like a backup, and then we can test the patches there before we put them into production. So that lowers the risk. There's still going to be some risk there, but it lowers the risk. But we want to be able to monitor and track those risks over time. That's usually when you talk about adding items to a risk register. So you have this master list of all the risks that you've identified and what you're actually doing about them. So we'll talk more about that in the 62443 section. Now, NIST also highlights 2 areas for special consideration, and as they should. So when they talk about supply chain and then also safety systems, or when we talked about the safety instrumented systems, the SIS, the fail-safe backups that we have, like with the Trisis incident. So supply chain, those are some of the attacks that, utterly fascinate me, like when we saw SolarWinds. And at the same time, also, they're some of the more threatening because there's very little that we can do about preventing at least the initial attack. We can detect when it's occurring and respond as quickly as possible. That goes back to the need for incident response and network security monitoring. But remember, with SolarWinds, if you're not familiar, and if we hadn't talked about it in the course yet, SolarWinds was where nation state Russia had compromised. They didn't break into Microsoft directly. They didn't break into Mandiant, right? One of the best, if not the best, incident response cybersecurity organizations in the world. They didn't break in directly to the Department of Defense in the United States. What they did was they broke into SolarWinds. SolarWinds makes software used by different companies and lots of different products, mostly around like IT and service monitoring. And so they had compromised the development servers for one of those products that was responsible for monitoring different aspects of network performance. And they built in their malicious code, essentially their backdoor, into the code. So when all these other organizations like Microsoft and Mandiant and the Department of Defense, they were doing the right thing and installing the latest and greatest updates. When they got that update from SolarWinds, they didn't realize the Russians had broken into SolarWinds and put malware into it. So when they're installing the update, they're letting the Russians into their systems. That was where Microsoft and Mandiant and the DoD and all these other entities were compromised, and they didn't know about it for 3 months. The only reason the world knew about it, at least how it was discovered, was someone at Mandiant realized there was login activity for somebody who was on vacation and verified the person who was on vacation that it wasn't them. And so Mandiant came out and said one day that they announced, hey, we've been breached. We're still doing research, but we're looking into the issue. We'll let you know more. And then the next day, I remember being on this call. The next day they announced, this is how we got breached. And it's not just us. It's all these other very large organizations. It's like, what do it's hard. There's only so many things you can do to lower the risk associated with outside vendors. In this case, like the software supply chain, because we do want to, especially in IT, right? We want to make sure we're updating our software as soon as possible. Not just for security patches, but also maybe it's fixing some, bugs and performance issues. But just in that case, we became infected because we were doing the right thing. So that could still happen. That's a great example of what could happen in OT as well. And it kind of leads into the example, or kind of references back to the last example that we were talking about with deploying Microsoft Patch Tuesdays. Patches, sorry. And then safety instrumented systems. Remember our fail-safe backup system. So if we ever find or detect a fault condition in the environment, we can shut down that plant or that section of the plant or the entire plant if we need to keep everyone and the environment and the plant safe. If there's an explosion in the plant, people could potentially get hurt, die. There could be an impact to the environment, and that part of your plant no longer exists. So your availability and uptime is out the window. So there's definitely, if there's one aspect or one area of the network that we want to protect more than any, it's going to be the SIS or those safety instrumented systems or the fail-safe backups. Now they talk about their risk management framework in 882. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we're going to spend more time on risk in 62443. So you can see that their framework that they describe in the document, so they talk about preparation, right? We categorize risk, we select, implement, assess. So when we perform the risk assessment, right? And then we'll always be reassessing. I think it's really the key here. Authorize and monitor over time. So again, we're going to come back and talk about more. So again, the risk management framework in NIST, I think a lot of people would think it's, I'm trying to think of the politically right way to put it. It's a good place to start. But when we talk about risk management, I think that's where most people are going to look to 62443. So we'll get to there in a minute. Now, 882 also talks about defense in depth. That's what we're always looking for, whether it's in IT or OT. Sometimes defense in depth is like a bad term in OT for some strange reason, which I don't understand. Especially going back to the grouchy old man in the industry. For some reason, they just don't like this approach of defense in depth. I'm like, I don't understand why. Because if we apply one security control like a firewall, right, there's no guarantee that the firewall is not going to fail in some way. Maybe we just misconfigure it incorrectly. Right? It fails. Right? So we want to have a backup. And in case that control fails, then we have another one and another one. And as long as we have time and resources, right, money and people to be able to implement the control, we want to continue to apply controls at least into that point where we meet our risk tolerance. We're going to come back and talk about this in the 62443 section as well. But this idea of the risk tolerance or the risk threshold is this idea of how much risk is the company or the owner of that plant willing to accept. Again, I don't want to jump too far ahead. I don't want to spend a ton of time here, so we're just going to go through these fairly quickly so we can spend the rest of our time in 62443. But they do a good job of highlighting, right? There's this whole aspect of how do we manage the cybersecurity program. So it's more of these when we talk about either like logical or administrative controls. So things like policies, right? How do we implement physical security? Remember, if somebody can come in the environment and touch an asset, they can control it. Remember, they can touch a PLC and they can take that key switch, let's say it has a physical key switch, and they can move it from run mode into program mode, then that would allow them the ability to do things like upload a malicious version of their firmware or change the programming code on the ladder logic on the PLC. Network security. So we've touched on a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about things like network security monitoring. Again, how important. It's a critical control to OT environments, even though most environments do not do it today. Hardware security and software security, right? Going back to our asset registers, how much control do we have? Do we have things like vulnerability management, continuous vulnerability management enabled in the environment? And then you can see, oh, and all these other things we have to think about as well, right? Physical and environmental safety, availability and uptime of the plant, right? What if we have SCADA, right? So it's not just a single physical location, but we're going out over WAN links to different types of environments. Like maybe I have substations for power transmission, or maybe I run an offshore wind farm. What about security at that lowest level of the Purdue model, right? The sensors and other instrumentation that we have. What about cybersecurity there? It's one of the most, or it's the most overlooked aspect of cybersecurity in OT. What if an attacker could gain access and manipulate that sensor data that's being fed into a PLC? Because that PLC is then use that, right, with its logic, with its programming to make changes to systems out in the real world. What are the implications there? And then remember, industrial Internet of Things, that's our cloud integration for OT, which still makes me cringe, but at the same time, there are definite business cases and it can be used effectively. We just want to make sure we do it as securely as possible. So they provide a lot of great guidance in 882 for a lot of different things. And then we mentioned they also try to wrap it up with and then tying it into the cybersecurity framework that was developed by NIST in the Obama administration. So this probably goes back at this point, I don't know, 15 years? I'd have to look it up, but off the top of my head. And so there's this idea, and you see this a lot, where you look at how does cybersecurity or how is it implemented in organizations, right? And you can look at these 5 main areas. So there's identify, right? We have to be able to have the tools and the people and resources to be able to identify if there's an attack in the environment. Right? Well, before that, there's a lot of work we have to do just to, and then there's this very general, vague protect. Right? A lot of what we do, most of what we do in cybersecurity is all about preventing an incident from happening in the first place. So things like implementing vulnerability management. Right? When we look at even doing something like penetration testing or doing risk assessments, right? That's all part of that protect. Do we have things, and then we move to, do we have things in place like network security monitoring, be able to detect if an attacker was in the environment, or what if there was a ransomware infection loose on the network? Will we be able to detect that? And if we did detect it, would we be able to respond efficiently and timely, right? Because the quicker we respond, the more efficient we are, the less the damage, right? The less the fallout is from that incident. And then ultimately, what the business really wants to know is when there is an incident, right? How quickly do we get back up and running? And that's that recover section. So when we look at it, there's the 5 kind of phases, right? Identifying and being able to understand things like what risks present to the environment. And we're going to come back and talk about that in 62443, right? Again, most of what we do in cybersecurity is about the controls we implement to protect the environment, prevent a incident from occurring in the first place. But we also have to be able to be prepared to detect if an attacker or some malicious event was occurring on the network, so we can respond effectively and, of course, recover, get the business back up and running as quickly as possible. And those are also key to 62443 as well. So that doesn't change, right? And I think that probably makes sense when we look at it just from an overall perspective. And then also maps out to, remember when we talked about the SANS incident response phases, the 6 phases, right? It's very, very similar to that. The problem, remember, in a lot of OT environments, they don't have the capabilities to detect if there's suspicious or malicious activity occurring in the environment. So if you can't detect, then you're just waiting for something to fail or to go down hard before you can even start to respond. That was like with Trisis or Colonial Pipeline. I had to wait for something to break to understand something was wrong in the environment and then to respond. So that's why I remember network security monitoring is one of those critical controls we have to deploy. But I think a lot of environments don't deploy it because it also takes resources. If I have network security monitoring, I have to have somebody, do the monitoring. But of course, in OT, we already have people always monitoring. So why not have the people doing the operations monitoring monitor those tools as well? Call me crazy if you aren't able to hire somebody dedicated for security. All right. So that wraps up 882. So I want to I spend more time, honestly, than I thought we would in 882. There's a lot there. Now, there's a lot of overlap with 62443. So where there's overlap, we'll kind of skip through 62443, but there's definitely sections of 62443 that I want to highlight. And I mentioned 62443 it's not free. So while it was built by the community, right, and engineers across these standards committees, it's not free, it's licensed. So you're either going to have to purchase it, and it's not necessarily cheap, depending, relatively, I guess, on your circumstances. I don't consider it inexpensive, but a solid investment, I should say. Also mentioned that you remember it's not a single standard. I always say it's a single standard because I think of it as one. I think everybody does, even though technically it's a family or a suite of standards that we'll actually look at. Now remember, ISA is a United States-based organization, but it's ultimately the IEC that sponsors the standard. And because IEC is seen as an international body, then it has international recognition, including, you can see, by the United Nations. So it goes a long way. So again, that's what, when people talk about 62443, if they mention ISA, again, and usually assume they're in the US or maybe Canada. If they say IEC, they're usually outside of the United States and Canada. And I can get that. There's this idea of shared responsibility model, not the kind we talk about in cloud cybersecurity, but really how everyone in the organization has to come together. And this is where we always talk about like IT and OT partnerships. And within OT, right, it takes everyone to come together to enforce cybersecurity. It's not the person of just job of one person or even one team, right? It's multiple people and multiple teams coming together. I've said it many times, I think by this time in the course, right? It's not just IT cybersecurity people and other folks from the IT side, but it's our engineers and our automation folks, our PLC programmers and technicians and the people doing operations and sitting, in the control room or the operations center doing everybody has to come together. The people doing operations and maintenance, right? Everybody has to come together. It's that shared responsibility. It's not, again, just one person or one team that's going to get it done. Even if there is a dedicated cybersecurity team, everybody plays a part. And he mentions the core concept really behind 62443, everything is built around risk. How do we manage risk? And really the key concept of conducting an effective risk assessment. They actually have even built out 2 different types of risk assessments, which we'll talk about. And again, you can either purchase the standards, and even each standard's like, I think I've seen them as much as like $100 for some, which again, you'll see there's 12 plus standards that actually make up 62443. Or you can, as an ISA member, you can get access to some of them for free. Also, if you take the 62443 certification exams and the courses, they give you they actually let you download PDFs. They'll actually send you PDFs of some of the standards, like the risk assessment, the risk management standard, which is the biggest one, which is the most important. And that's the one that's central to all of 62443. So if you really want to learn and implement 62443, that's the big one, right? That's the most important one. So if you go to, and I'll pull up my account and show you what it looks like in the portal, just so you can start to get an idea. So here I'm logged in to the page. This is actually the ISA website. This is actually the page for their CAP associate certificate, and then there's a certification around understanding how OT works. So this is a great certification for people coming from the IT world that want to understand really understand the basics of OT environments. So definitely, if you come from the IT world, definitely check it out. I'm actually going to be doing those certifications next. They do have some requirements, like you have to have like degrees and such, but definitely check that out. If it's something that, again, if you come from the IT side and you're really serious about OT cybersecurity, I think they're actually incredible resources. So, anyways, so once you're into the ISA website, you want to go up to publications, and they have this thing called PubHub. So if you go to PubHub, and then you have to log in to that. So it just uses, I think, single sign-on, yeah. And then you can see, and there's a lot of great resources. So whether it's their podcast or different ebooks, and they publish a lot of books, so there's a lot of sample. I don't think there's a lot of full books online, so you have to purchase those as well. And then you see training, webinars, but we won't go to standards. And then here you can see all the standards that ISA does. So remember, ISA is from the engineering perspective, right? They touch on every aspect of the engineering world, right? In OT environments. So you can see just standards for HMIs, and there's one just for like safety instrumented system, the SIS, right? 61511. Well, of course, we're talking about 62443, which came out of the ISA 99 committee. So you can see the cybersecurity for industrial automation and control systems. So that's where if you ever see IACS, that's what IACS stands for, industrial automation and control systems. We used to see that a lot. Even Floor used to use it a lot. Now we just say control systems, and now a lot of people just say ICS OT. OT has been a big term over the last couple of years. And so you can see here's the standards that they allow you to have. And here's, where you can see it's not one standard, it's not one big document, it's a bunch of different standards. There's 14, I guess. I should have counted them before. And you can tell they're actually numbered, but they're also broken up into 4 different types of standards, right? So you can see general, policies and procedures, the system component. Honestly, I look at this and I don't know, it just makes me want to throw up. I think I know it's horrible to say. I think that's why just the way it's structured throws a lot of people off. I don't think I am the only one. Anyways, and so you can see for each one of these kind of categories, right? So you can see under the general category, you can see there's 1-1, right? That just that's kind of like an introduction to OT cybersecurity. You can see 1-2, that's like their entire glossary of definitions for OT terms that they use throughout the standard. Sorry. I was thinking about how I could show these to you, and then it's like, oh, I can't because they are licensed. 1-3. So you can see metrics, right? And these are like 100+ page PDFs, right? These are not light reading. There you can see ICS, right? Security lifecycle for 1-4. Policies and procedures. And we're actually going to talk about all these at a high level, so I don't want to jump too far ahead. But I wanted to show you this to get an understanding. Oh yeah, 62443, it's not just one standard. It's actually, I still like to think of it as one standard in 14 parts, even though, yes, these are 14 different standards. And they're continually being added, over time, right? Software, or secure product development lifecycle did not always exist, right? Safety and instrumented system, right? Safety, cybersecurity requirements did not always exist. I think they existed a lot longer, before the secure product development lifecycle for sure. Anyways, this idea, again, there's 14 standards that make up 62443. So this is kind of what that looks like. Again, I'm not a fan. This idea that, I can see, 1-1, right, which is their general overview. And then when you get into 3-2 and 3-3, that's really the core of 62443, I think, for most people. And that's because that's where we look at how do we perform those risk assessments? How do we identify risk? How do we address the risk to within our risk tolerance or risk threshold? And that is done by using what we call security levels. So I'm going to leave it at that for a moment because we're going to jump into all of that. So again, you can see at least you get 3.2, 3-2, and 3-3. Again, the key ones around risk assessment and risk management. And then you can also see 4.1, 4.2, 2.3, and the other document that they have there. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you get roughly half, or you do get half of the standards for, I guess, quote unquote, free if you're an ISA member. I think ISA membership is it's like $125 or something like that a year. So it's relatively inexpensive, and it's a lot cheaper than buying the standards as a whole. Now, there are some great books, and this is why if you don't want to invest in the standards, like I always say, get an ISA membership. And again, the key to 62443 is understanding the risk assessment component, right? So you can get those 3-2, 3-3. You can get those, as an ISA member, and you don't have to pay for them separately. But in understanding 62443, there are some great resources out there. There aren't a ton, but these two books I really appreciated, so I wanted to share them. So there's the Exida book. So Exida is a company in the OT space, and they do cybersecurity, and they even offer, we actually talked about them in the very first section or first part of the course where we talked about those other cybersecurity certifications out there. So Exida does offer cybersecurity OT certifications, and we have engineers at Floor that have their certifications. So you could see a couple of their folks had written a book called Implementing IEC 62443, a pragmatic approach to cybersecurity. I actually have it sitting here on my desk. I reference it a lot when doing risk assessment work, so it's great. There's a lot I could talk about in the sake of time. Yeah, definitely. If there's one book I was going to buy about 62443, that would be it, because it does explain at a high level, and it doesn't go too in depth, but it gives you what you need to know to get the job done, which I really like, and I guess that's the pragmatic approach. So definitely check that out. I think it's like $140 or something like that when I bought it off of Amazon. And then there's also industrial cybersecurity. Somebody had mentioned this. This is Steve Mustard's book. I think I'm going to track him down at S4 this year, but to say hi. I really actually enjoyed reading this book because it's just these kind of practical, real world scenarios on not only OT cybersecurity, but also references, of course, a lot with 62443. So I think that's really cool. And you can see he has like his CAP. That was that kind of that certification we were just talking about as far as how all the OT components work together, right? It's like a mini engineering degree, which is great, again, for people that are coming from the IT world. We're probably not looking at becoming principal engineers. That's the PE there. But CAP is very realistic. Of course, GICSP is from SANS, and we talked about that in the first part of the course. So again, two great books. If you're really getting serious about implementing and you're working with 62443, I definitely highly recommend both of those. So again, with 62443, we have all of these we have these 4 different categories of standards. So there's the general that, and we started to go over these, right? It's 1-1, it's another one of those, which is like with the beginning of the NIST document. It's great because it gives you that high level overview, and you can learn a lot by reading it. But again, you either have to pay for it or pay for a ISA membership to be able to legally, access the content. Again, it's pretty interesting that they have an entire document just for their glossary, but that's how significant or large it is. So, but understanding, how to build a metrics program, which is something that a lot of IT people probably fail at. I consider myself probably fairly good at that these days, but it took me a long time to get there, for sure. It's just not something, us IT or OT, like our technically minded folks, usually think about. It just isn't, at least not for me. So, and then they talk about the security life cycle, which I did want to bring up here, right? Because ISA is this ever kind of round and round, or this circular, never, this approach that we're always continually to improve, right? That's, again, I mentioned like with the ISO standard, I really appreciate the one thing I appreciate out of everything is the focus on continual improvement. Right? Because even when we do a risk assessment in 62443 and we understand, or we've identified these different risks, and then we've even implemented controls to either eliminate or at least reduce the risk in the environment, and that, well, we're going to maintain that overall level of cybersecurity in the environment. And then we're going to come back, and then we're going to do a new risk assessment. And maybe it's a year down the road. Maybe an environment, they only do it every other year, or maybe every other 3 years. That's probably pushing it. Most environments will do it on an annual basis. Perform a risk assessment, right? Find our risks, find our issues, right? Understand how bad are they. Then we're going to apply security controls to lower the risk to a level that the company, the owners, find acceptable. And then we'll continue to maintain our posture there until, next year, right? We're going to come back and do a reassessment. So we're always continually reassessing, right? And there's always, and part of that reassessment needs to be looking at the current threat landscape, understanding what's happening out in the world. If you're not looking to see what's going on out there, and we talked about this when we got into cyber threat intelligence, right? Then you're not going to understand the different types of attacks and the different types of attackers that are coming after you. So I know we've talked about that, so I'm going to move on as well. But that's the basis for 62443 is this idea of we're going to do these risk assessments, understand the problems we have in the environment. We're going to take action to either address those issues 100% or at least reduce them to a level we're comfortable with. And then we're going to maintain that level of security until we come back and do it all over again. But we're always continually reassessing. And that during that maintenance phase, there's still always continual improvements we should be working on. Now, the second set of standard, second category, when we talk about policies and procedures. So it's great that they come up in like with 2.2-1, this is, again, a big part like we saw in 800-82. This is one of the questions I get asked commonly is, well, how do we build a cybersecurity program? And I get a lot. I've never thought this would happen, but I would say almost on a weekly basis, I get a message from somebody saying, hey, I just took over as a CISO for this OT environment. I come from the IT world. How do I build a cybersecurity program for OT? Once a week, easily, which is really, again, I find it really interesting. And so I point to, hey, there's 800-82 if you need something especially free to get up and running, or hey, there's 62443, which is really, we say, the gold standard. Right? And then you can see the other parts that support that. So when we get to security program ratings, we look at patch management, right? So how do we do patch management in the control systems network? Are we regularly patching at least those Windows-based hosts like domain controllers, data historians, and file and print servers, and engineering workstations? Hopefully. What about those HMIs running Windows though? Do we actively patch those? I know we've talked about those in the past as well. Right? The requirements we're going to have for our outside service providers, and think, if anything, like the different vendors that you're going to, what about those vendors you're giving remote access to come into the OT network over the wire to do work? And then they talk about kind of this overall guidance for the asset owner level. I think that's probably why I don't know. I'm still trying to determine why they make some of these available in their pub hub and why some they don't. Anyways, sorry, I'm getting a little lost in my conversation, I guess, or try not to get lost. Anyways, must be past my bedtime. System standards, right? When you get to the third category. So this is where I talk about this is essential. So 3-1 talks about, here's different types of security controls that you can deploy in a control system environment. Great. Awesome. It's kind of like a menu of things that we can deploy to reduce risk, right? Awesome. 3-2, 3-3, again, this is the heart of 62443. This is really what we're talking about when building out an overall program. That's why we didn't spend as much time on all the other documents, because this is really what it comes down to. So what you're going to do is in 62443, you're going to have security levels defined for different aspects of your network. Now, let's take it at a high level. Like I just worked with a client, and this is a client outside of Floor, and so a manufacturing client. Really cool environment, great team to work with. Had a blast. So when you look at just at a high level over their entire environment, this is again going back, what are we trying to protect against? Right? I'm not like a nuclear power plant. So I don't have, let's see, in this case, I don't have like proprietary secret formulas that I'm worried about protecting. So I'm not worried about, or I'm not concerned with, like nation state actors coming into the environment. But like any OT environment, I should at least be concerned with things like ransomware. So you can see with these security levels, and you can see security level 0 all the way to security level 4. Security level 0 means there is no security. We don't have any requirements for security. Like, okay, that shouldn't exist, but it could be an option. You can see security level 4, that's where you can see protection against intentional violation using sophisticated means with extended resources. What that means is we need to be protected against advanced nation state actors. Well, we can imagine, okay, well, there's protection against advanced nation state actors, and then there's no security. Well, no security doesn't cost anything. If I want to protect against advanced nation state actors, there's significant cost. And even then, are we really 100% protected? So you can kind of think of this as a sliding scale of, well, how much security are we going to apply and how much is it going to cost? Now, there's protection you can see against casual and coincidental violation for security level 1. So a lot of that's usually employees doing stupid things that they shouldn't be doing. That's what a lot of that typically tends to be. Or if somehow you got a script kiddie, remember one of those little quote unquote hackers that they just downloaded a free tool, and maybe you accidentally had an asset exposed to the internet, and they found it through Shodan and they threw an exploit at it and got lucky. And they used it to get a foothold on the OT network. Or maybe it was one of your, CCTV cams that was exposed to the internet that they compromised, right? Somebody got lucky, right? It wasn't an advanced nation state attacker. Just somebody got lucky. Or again, somebody more than likely inside, they were just doing something stupid. And maybe, we've seen this happen, right? Someone brings in, they want to bring in family pictures from home. They put it on a USB drive that they plug into their home computer, which is infected. Infection gets onto the USB drive, and then they bring it into the environment to plug it into their engineering workstation. And now the engineering workstation is infected. And potentially that infection is spreading. Right? That's kind of what we want to protect against. We want to make sure we apply the security controls to prevent that casual or coincident violation. Now, security level 2, that's where we want to protect against not just employees doing stupid things, but we're protecting against intentional violation. So that's where we're protecting against attackers. And then you can see, well, the difference between security level 2 and security level 3. So we're protecting against intentional violation using simple means versus sophisticated means. So the way I usually approach this in general is that at a basic minimum, we want to protect the environment against simple means, which for me means just about every ransomware operator out there, right? That's the main focus these days. And by protecting against that, we protect against all the other, kind of common categories of cyber attacks. Now, there's sophisticated means, which means I like to think of, there are more advanced types of ransomware group operators out there, though. You can tell there's some that it's almost like, and probably have, right? Some of them probably worked for nation states in some way, shape, or form, and that they, retired from that type of work, and now they're out on their own, right? Not everybody that worked for nation states went on to become cybersecurity contractors and be defenders of environments. And then and then you just have some really brilliant people out there, right, that are doing really bad things. So the way I look at this typically, and it's a long story, but I'll say at a high level, I like to think we want to protect the entire OT environment from harm from at least covering, right, people making mistakes, doing things that they shouldn't, right, unintentionally. And then the intentional, right, the attackers using simple means, the common attackers, common ransomware groups. And then when I look at, well, what about those mission critical areas of the network? Or remember when we talk about zones? Remember when we talked about secure network infrastructure in one of the first parts? That actually all comes from 62443, right? We break up the network into the zones. So what about the zone for my safety instrumented system, my SIS, my fail-safe backup? Well, I want to make sure that's protected, yeah, not just from attackers using simple means, but I want to have it protected from those with more, abilities and capabilities. Again, maybe not nation state attackers, but I want to protect it against those with more abilities and more capabilities than the average ransomware operator. That's how I look at it in general these days. Hopefully that makes sense. So there's going to be, I want at least security level 2 across the board, but there's also some zones that, like if I have a SIS, I want to protect that from even the more advanced types of attackers. Again, not worry about nation states in most environments unless I work for some type of government entity or we have something that a nation state has been known to want to steal. I'll kind of leave it at that for the moment. We'll come back and talk a little bit more. Now, we mentioned when in 62443 we break up the network into these different zones. And so we're going to assign they call it target level zone target security level to each zone. And what I was thinking of there as I was talking was this is one of those things it's one of those little things I don't like about 62443. And again, it's another one that I think I get from a lot of people as well. It's like, oh, it's target security level, so that should be TSL. No, it's SL-T. So it's like security level -target. Okay. So we have a target security level. What do I want the security level of this zone to be? Remember, most zones, I'm going to want them to be at security level 2. Right? I want them protected against ransomware, right? Again, biggest threat we have today by far for OT environments, ransomware. But again, I want a little bit extra protection when it comes to those mission critical zones, like the SIS, or think in manufacturing, we mentioned like the manufacturing execution system, the MES, that coordinates all of the manufacturing to actually occur. I want that additional protection there. So I'm going to assign a security level of 3, a target security level of 3 to those mission critical zones. So that's the idea of how we go from there's these different security levels and then how we assign a target level. Now, when we come back and do the risk assessments, that's where we determine what's the actual security level of this zone, right? If I'm looking at that zone that has, let's see, that manufacturing execution system, the MES or the MES. I know I always say MES or MES. The idea is, well, what is the security level? You might look at it and like, there's like hardly any security here, right? So it might be like security level almost like a 0 or maybe a 1, right? Well, what's our actual security level? Because we want to be at a 2, but if we're at a 0 or a 1, we've got a lot of work to do. And that's a big part of the risk assessment process, is just understanding where we want to be, where are we today, and then how are we going to get there. So we really focus on the target security level and the achieve security level. Now we'll come back and talk about the capability security level. Okay, this is just worded strangely. Because there's this idea of foundational requirements. So you can see, and there's 7 of them. And so you can see that these are, if you look at any cybersecurity standards, whether it's ISO or NIST, or you see very similar types of requirements. So you things like, oh, how do we identify user, right? Username and password. Do we multi-factor authentication? How do we prove somebody is who they say they are on the network? Once we authenticate them based off of that identification, then what do we do, right? So that builds into use control, right? What permissions and what do people get permissions and access to do on the network once we've identified and authenticated them? How do we ensure system integrity? Whether it's different applications running on all of those Windows systems we have in the environment? Or what about the programming in our PLCs? Or what about the firmware in those assets? Has it been changed or manipulated by an attacker? Data confidentiality. In some environments, we worry about that more than others. But what if I do have a process that I am concerned with somebody coming in, and maybe what if a ransomware group came in, stole my proprietary formula, and threatened to publish it out on the internet? That would be a very bad day. Right? Restricted data flow. Right, that goes back to, do we have firewalls? Do we have network segmentation? Are we using the principle of least privilege when doing things like access control list? Only allowing specific assets to talk with only those assets they need on only the ports that they need. And then even doing micro segmentation, so we're making sure that even assets in the same zone can't talk to each other unless they absolutely need to. Because again, it's always that question of, well, what happens if an attacker gets into one asset in that zone? What could they do? You can see FR6, right? How quickly can we respond to incidents, right? And part of that is, how quickly can we restore functionality? What if just a PLC goes down? And what if it just shorts out for some bizarre, strange reason? Do we have a spare sitting there? Can we restore a backup of the ladder logic to that PLC? How long does that take? 30 minutes, 30 days, hopefully a lot less. But I have seen environments where there are no spares, and then they go to buy one when they lose an asset, and they can't find one, and they can't get one for like 7, 8, 9, 10 days. That's scary. So I just want to make sure we have spares, even though spares it's one of those things people forget about for some reason in OT. At least with like PLCs and HMIs and those types of assets for some reason. And then, of course, ensuring availability. So those are the foundational requirements that we apply. So where that rolls up into is, and this is an example, it came from one of the Cisco documents that I thought was a fairly good example of, it gives you an idea of taking foundational requirements, in this case, like identification and authentication controls, right? So we have requirements for how do we identify people as they come onto the network by using things like usernames and passwords or multi-factor authentication for stronger security. And then how we map that to the security level. So remember, security level 0 means there's no security, so we don't even see that. So we're just focused on, if I'm protecting against, again, the casual employee doing something that they shouldn't be, that's security level 1. Security level 4, that's nation state attackers. So more than likely, again, most environments are looking for security level 2, maybe security level 3 in mission critical zones. Okay, if you have no security today, start with security level 1 and build from there, right? And so it gives you that idea, and you can look in through 62443 and says, okay, if you have no security today, let's get you to security level 1. Here's how we're going to get you there, right? And basically, and then you can look these up in the document for things like, you're going to use usernames and passwords, and every user is going to have a unique user account. They're going to have a unique password. Right? It shouldn't match what they have also on the IT side of the house, even though I don't think that's probably documented. That's just me wishful thinking. You see, there's account management. So we do things like, well, how do we create those accounts when we onboard them? What happens when that person leaves the company, right? Do we have an offboarding process? As part of that offboarding process, do we disable their account? Or maybe we just completely blow it away. Maybe at least disable it and reset the password. So in case it gets re-enabled, which I've seen happen, that the user couldn't come in. And people always think, oh, well, they'll never come back in. Right? Once somebody's gone, they're gone. Well, I can tell you that's not always the case. It's amazing, actually. I can tell you how many employees, when they leave a company, they actually try to continue to log back into the systems. We see it. I mean, Flora has about 35,000 computer users right at the moment. And it seems like every week there's somebody that leaves the company and they think they can just keep logging into the systems. I think a lot of times they want to come and log in and download their previous work content because they think they could use it at their next job. But hopefully this gives you, that's why I liked kind of this layout. It's not perfect, but I thought they did a really good job of saying, hey, here's functional requirements. And then you can have this little chart and just imagine a lot of charts like this to say if you're going to implement 62443 and you want to get to, let's say, security level 1, here are these 3 things that you need to do. And you take these and look them up in the document to see, okay, here's exactly what I need to do for these things. And then you see, oh, okay, security level 2. So I want to protect against, right, most forms of ransomware. If I want to protect against, the most important, like even the most sophisticated types of ransomware, then that's security level 3. You'll find it interesting that they don't even get to multi-factor authentication until you get to, I want to protect against nation state adversaries with security level 4. Because there's been definite cases where we've implemented multi-factor in OT, right? And in special things, of course, you would think for sure for like secure remote access. Or what about moving from IT to OT if that was allowed? I want to always have at least multi-factor authentication there. But hopefully, again, that gives you an example if you have this chart and what it would look like to say, hey, okay, what's your target security level? What do you want to hit? Security level 1? Great. Here's what you need. Here's the 3 things you need to do, right? Oh, you want security level 2 now, right? You're ready to take it to the next step. Well, here's these 5 different things that you need. Well, you've already got 3 of them, right? So here's 2 more that you need to add. So then you go back in and look those up in the standard to see what those actually are. So we mentioned with 62443, all of it's really based off of this idea, though, of really centers around also performing the risk assessment. Because remember, back here we talked about, we have this target security level that is where we want to get to, right? So let's say we want to get to security level 2, right? I want to protect against the vast majority of common ransomware. Well, where are we? We might think we have great security. We might think we're already at a 3. So we're like, hey, we're done. We went above and beyond. But maybe it's really a 1. Or maybe it's a 2. Maybe it's a 3. This is where you really need to bring in somebody from the outside to be able to make a unbiased decision. And where you create, and so 62443 has this idea of really, there's actually 2 types of risk assessments. There's this high level, and then there's a more detailed risk assessment. Usually, at least in my world, a high level risk assessment is performed at the very beginning of a project before we even have a completely designed environment. We just understand maybe we're building a power plant or an LNG facility, and it's going to have these types of systems, and it's going to have these different types of zones at a very high level. Maybe these different types of assets, right? So we'll know, there's DCS and PLCs and HMIs, and these are the processes at a high level, right? We're going to generate electricity, so we're going to have turbines and combustion chambers and generators. It's very high level. So this is kind of that where you build out the system under consideration. And you can see that we do that. The upper left-hand corner, that's very important. And they're giving you the idea of, what can we bring in to help us do this? So you look at, any engineering or architecture diagrams that you have, right? Asset register. Again, at this point, though, you might not even have these, or if you do, they're just not complete. They're very high level. Are there any security policies that exist, right? That comes into play because remember, policies is where cybersecurity starts. We have to have kind of those internal laws that are authorized by the highest power in the environment that tell our people what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. And if you step out of line, if you do those things you're not supposed to, you're going to get in trouble. right? Do we have any regulations that we fall under, right? If I'm building a power plant in the middle of the United States, then yeah, I'm going to fall under NERC CIP. You can also say, well, what about, are we going through any standards? Well, of course, we're following this process where we already know we're doing 62443. We have to understand what's the organization's, what's the owner's level of tolerable risk? What's that risk threshold? How much risk are they willing to accept? And that's where hey, are we going to be security level 1? We're just going to protect against the really basic casual types of people making mistakes, or do we want to actually protect against actual attackers coming after us, like with security level 2, and protect against ransomware? That's where we're going to determine what is the security level. An organization might say, hey, we're going to accept the risk and we're just not going to do anything about security level. Okay, security level 0, we're done. Obviously, that's not the case for most organizations these days, thankfully. But it is kind of, well, then what are we going to be? Because again, level 1, hey, if you don't have any security, level 1's a great place to start. But I think most organizations want to be at that security level 2, where they're protected against things like ransomware. Or at least most ransomware groups. Just not some of those more advanced type of attackers. Again, that's just the way I look at it. But you go through this process, and you can start to see, and again, that's where, remember that the network is broken down into those zones. And then the communication between zones is what we call conduits. I know at a high level, let's say for now. Again, that's where we look at, okay, well, what's our target zone security requirements? Where are we today? So if we're at security level 1 today and we want to be at a 2, well, what are we going to need to do to get there? Now, when we do a more detailed cybersecurity risk assessment, this is where we do all of those things and that much more. Right? Because there's this idea, yes, we have this target security level that we want to get to. And we're going to look at what controls that we need to apply to get there. And we continue to apply controls until we get there. But it's about lowering that risk. So there's these massive calculations that you can have, or scores. I don't think I had any examples. But you have these calculations to determine, again, when I go at, let's say I'm trying to think of a common, so let's go back to our manufacturing example, and I have the zone that has the MES, the manufacturing execution system. And I want to make sure that is at a security level 3. Again, it's mission critical. We cannot have anything go wrong with this system. If something goes wrong with the system, we're down. And we're probably down for a long time. So looking at that MES, I want it security level 3. But then it's not just a question of security levels, because we look at, well, what are the different types of risks? This is where we go back, and as mentioned earlier, we look at each asset in the zone. And we ask, what would happen if an attacker got onto this asset? So what if an attacker got onto the primary server of the MES? What could they do? What's the worst? I always like to ask, what's the worst case scenario? And then what's probably the most realistic scenario? Like, what if ransomware got on the box? What would happen then? Right? We'd have to rebuild the machine. Well, how long does it take to rebuild the machine? Do we have that data backed up? Oh, we have it backed up? Great. When's the last time we did a test restore? Oh, we've never done a test restore. That's a risk. Like, oh, they didn't run anti-malware software on the server because they were afraid that it was going to interfere, cause performance issues. That's a risk. And that wasn't a case for my client, just to say, I'm just throwing that out there. I've seen that at other places. even in IT. So the detailed risk assessment, it becomes more, it's just so much more about security levels. It's looking at and you usually have a list of, let's say, 12 different types of attacks that you're concerned with. And you look at how each of those could impact that zone, which also then in turn impacts all of operations. So then you calculate this, basically you get these individual risk scores, and then you have to determine, okay, is that risk score above or below the risk tolerance of the organization? So if the risk is considered too high, then we have to apply security controls to lower the risk. It's like, oh, you don't have anti-malware software installed? Let's install it and lower the risk. It's a no-brainer. If you had performance issues because of, okay, then you could uninstall it. But let's start with installing it first. Right? Lower the risk, bring it within the threshold. And then once you're under the threshold, then you could say you're good and you can stop. Or remember, we always want to continue to improve as resources allow. So always push to improve as you have time and money to do so. And I understand those are not things that are unlimited, of course. But I always want to continue to improve security. And this is where I just blew up those different sections to make them a little bit easier to read. So those detailed cybersecurity risk assessments take days. I've done, for some of the largest environments in the world, and they can take 4 or 5 days, and you can have 20, 30 people involved with them over the course of the week. And it brings up the point because, well, who do we have doing the risk assessment? I want to make sure you get all the right people in the room. So you usually have like that unbiased party, right, coming in to and make sure they have the right credentials and the experience to lead the workshop. Remember, but you want that unbiased opinion. And then you bring in the people that know about the environment the best, right? The engineers, the people doing operation maintenance if it's an existing environment, the technicians, right? Maybe you have IT team members, right? Cybersecurity team members, right? Everybody you need to bring in to understand how the environment works and how it's currently being protected, and be able to have those conversations with everybody. What would be the worst case scenario if an attacker got on this HMI in this zone? What if they got on this PLC? Right? What if ransomware took down the MES primary server? What would happen? And looking at those risks, and then it's like, well, what do we need to deploy to protect against that? Again, that's at a very high level. Again, you could have a 40-hour class on how to conduct a 62443 risk assessment, literally. But hopefully that gives you an idea. That's why going back to, if I can go back and find it, I really liked the 62443 books from the Exida folks, because I think they did a really good job at a high level of walking you through the risk assessment process. And if you ever have to do a risk assessment for 62443 or any OT, just risk assessment in general, I would, again, the book, again, maybe $140 US. It's the perfect investment if that's what you need to do. So definitely check that out. I want to talk about the other standards just real quickly, so you can see there's the component category. So they talk about there's a standard for products, and you could actually, believe it or not, you can actually buy OT assets, things like PLCs and controllers and others that they actually are 62443 certified. Now, it's very expensive. We've actually had clients at Flora ask about building a 62443 compliant environment. Can you do it? Yes, it's just going to increase your cost exponentially. and it limits you to certain products that you can use, right? So it's not like where you can just choose any products. It's a I mean, there's more products on the list than I thought there would be, honestly, but it's not. Still, at the same time, it's not a very long list. So between 4-1 and 4-2, idea is you have all the development lifecycle requirements, the component supplier responsibilities, which is something fairly new, and then also more information on compliance with 62443 and ultimate certification. Remember, you can build a 62443 certified environment. You're just limited to using those control systems that are certified, which makes sense. So you just have to choose certified equipment to work with, and that might or might not work in the environment you're trying to build. I think, to my understanding, like we're like at Fluor, where we build again some of the world's largest environments, there aren't enough of different assets that we would require to be able to build a 62443 compliant facility. But that goes back to, at the end of the day, it's all about the client's risk threshold, right? The risk tolerance. How much risk are they willing to accept? Which then goes back to those conversations around service levels. Remember, what is our target security level? Sorry. What's our target security level, right? And where do we stand today, right? What's the achieved security level? Where are we today? And where do we need to be? So there's a lot to 62443. Again, it's more like a 40-hour class in and of itself. But hopefully that's, again, gets you the high level. I think some of the key terms or the key parts that when I was starting to learn 62443, there's the kind of the life cycle that we go through, and we can jump back to that slide if we want real quick. Right, assess the environment. And so now we've already talked about, conducting the risk assessment, understanding where we're at, where we need to be, implementing countermeasures or additional security controls to lower the risk within a acceptable threshold. And then hopefully maintain, or really, again, continual improvement. And we're just in this cycle. So we should be doing those risk assessments every year. And then, of course, those other key concepts, like we talked about, the security level. So, understanding the difference from 0, where we have no security, to security level 4, where we're protected, or at least as much as we're going to be, against advanced nation state attackers, and everything in between. Remember, security level 1, employees doing things that they shouldn't be, realistic mostly. So security level 2 is where I think most environments need to be, right? We're protected against common ransomware infections. Slightly more sophisticated attackers, including some of the more sophisticated ransomware attackers, that's going to be security level 3. Again, we talked about where are we as far as what's our target security level, what's, or where we want to be is the target security level. Where we're at today is the achieved security level, right? And how do we get from where we're at today to the target? Right? If we want to be at security level 2 and we're already at a security level 2, then we could say we're done. Again, I hate that. And if we can still look for continual improvement, right? Just because we meet the security level, does that mean security has to stop? I just don't think so. Though, I talk with a lot of folks where they hit that number and they're done, which again, I just doesn't really set well for me. So we covered the foundational requirements, right? The 7 different ones, and then kind of that look that Cisco had at how this aligns with determining which controls you need to hit a specific security level. And then, of course, key to 62443 is that overall risk assessment process, which again looks really strange at first, but hopefully talking through it at the high level, it gives you at least an idea. And then if it's something that you need for your job, go back and look at those other resources, like the book that the Exodus folks put out, or Steve Mustard's book as well, with the use cases, which I thought were really great. So
there's a couple other standards to talk about real quickly just to wrap up. So I mentioned ISO 27001, 27002, which I've worked at Fluor for about 13 and a half years now at this point, and we've always talked about our cybersecurity program is based off of ISO 27001, 27002, but we hadn't undergone the certification process until most recently. But the nice thing is it's from ISO, so it's an internationally recognized standard. Right? It's not solely focused and from one particular country or one particular country's government. Right? And the idea is that so 27001 is a standard that talks about or explains how do you build a cybersecurity a management program for your environment, again for IT. So that's what they call the Information Security Management System, or the ISMS. So it's this formal program that you build to implement cybersecurity. And there's lots of checks and balances, as you would imagine in any type of, I kind of think of it as like a compliance framework more than anything. So there's lots of work that you have to do, right, to make sure that not only have you implemented all these different security controls, and those are described in 27002, but that you're continually monitoring the effectiveness of those controls over time. And that remember that main additional focus from ISO is the need for continual improvement. I've always appreciated it, even though it's not necessarily something that's easy to do. Right? It's almost like, especially at an organization the size of Fluor, maintaining ISO is a full-time job. But we want to, over time, just continually to improve security step by step, even if it's little by little. As long as we're better today than we were yesterday, that's what matters. And I think that should be in any environment, IT, OT, right? Whether we're already at security level 2 and we want to be at a security level 2, that doesn't mean we can't do more, that we can't continue to improve. So as long as we have the resources, as long as we have the time and the budget, let's continue to improve. Right? But that ISO. Again, ISO's focused on the IT world. But again, there's some parts of it that we can apply to OT. Now, we mentioned NERC CIP, a couple times, and it's that federal regulation or regulation within North America and it's really meant to, of course, protect the power grid within the United States, Canada, that as they're all interlinked, and then parts of Mexico where they're interlinked. So it's parts of Mexico, just like south of Texas, and Baja California, so like Tijuana and down, so under like south of California, if you're familiar. And so again, it's designed for any facilities that generate power or transmit power, right? It's a basic set of standards that you follow to ensure that you've implemented, right, cybersecurity in your environment and you're secure. I would say it's a great standard. Is it, perfect? No, not by any means. It's like most standards that you'll see today. We always talk about, I mentioned like Fluor has to be, SOX compliant, or if you've heard of things like HIPAA or PCI in the United States. So if you work in medical industries, or if you, like with PCI, if you process credit card or debit card numbers, or you have like Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which is over financial institutions. The idea is that whether you're or even if you're compliant, you're still going to get compromised. Right? This idea of being compliant just means we've put our best foot forward. We followed all these instructions, all these guidelines, all these best practice, all these requirements, with the idea that all the work we do today is going to delay the fact that we are breached. It's just going to push it down further into the future. But it's going to happen. Hopefully it's not for years and years to come. So again, so NERC CIP should be really, it's another one where think of it as a starting point. I think of it a lot like PCI. It's great. Here's a lot of, great requirements. Build your cybersecurity program, but continue to improve over time. Like I said, don't just make it this exercise and I want to make sure I'm compliant and I can pass an audit. Right? Go above and beyond. The more work we do, right, it's pushing that breach further down the road. Now, I mentioned CFATS, which I had always come across in conversations, but really hadn't had a lot of direct interaction with in our projects, like on a very limited basis, right? But the idea is, and I mentioned most of the chemical facilities we build are outside of the United States. So, but in the United States, so the Department of Homeland Security has different requirements. You mentioned when we look at what they have deemed as high risk chemicals or chemicals of interest, right? COIs. And the idea is, understanding, if we had some type of facility that had these chemicals and that was like worst case scenario, the target of a terrorist attack, right? What would actually happen? And so, and I'm gonna jump ahead and then come back because, I guess my biggest question is, well, what are some examples of chemicals of interest, right? What are these COIs? And so you can look at different categories and what the damage potentially could be, right? If it's some type of toxic chemical that's released into the atmosphere, right? Chemicals that are flammable. Right. And then you can see even they get into chemicals that can be used for theft and diversion, right? Or sabotage, contamination, right? Dual use chemicals, which I would think is maybe a lot of these, but again, I'm not an engineer and I'm not a chemical expert, so I'm not a chemist. So I thought it was interesting though to look at some of those examples and how they kind of break down these different categories. So it's like, oh yeah, it does make sense. When you look at chemicals of interest and where they're located. So you can see it. This is similar to a lot of other federal requirements that you see, even like with the TSA, which also falls under the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to come back and talk about the TSA requirements, but the idea that you have to have basically this idea of a site security plan, and that you have to have somebody that oversees that plan and is responsible for not only implementing the plan, but also the one person that people come to with concerns. And you can see, and there's regular inspections and audits, so they'll come and make sure that you have your site security plan and that it's tested and that you're compliant with all aspects. So I thought that was interesting. Again, it was one of those areas that I didn't have a lot of direct experience with, some indirect, but mostly indirect. Now, TSA Security Directives, again, I do have much more experience in, and whether from the limited more on the pipeline, but more so on the rail side, which we mentioned. It was interesting because these came out of the Colonial Pipeline breach. So we thought, oh, okay, well, that makes sense that it's going to impact pipeline operators. But where I mostly got involved was with rail operators. It's like we mentioned earlier, if you had a pipeline, like Colonial Pipeline goes down, and let's say it goes down for good, and the government realizes, well, we still need to get gas from, let's say, down in the south middle part, south central part of the United States, where Texas is, where Houston is basically, the kind of the oil capital of the world, or I should say the United States, sorry, and carrying that right through the pipeline up the entire East Coast. So the only backup plan would be able to shift that type of movement to trains. So it's not ideal. It's definitely not as effective or efficient, but something's better than nothing. So not only do those cybersecurity requirements cover pipeline operators, but also rail operators as well, including commuter rail, which is a lot of the work that I do at Floor. So we do a lot of subway, right? Light commuter rail. Well, they're like large metropolitan areas in the United States. So that's where, and you can see the idea that you have to have a designated cybersecurity coordinator, that one person that everything rolls up to, and they're responsible for implementing the program and making sure that it is implemented correctly and completely. And that if there was an incident, that would be the person that's going to contact Homeland Security to let them know about the incident. Now, the reporting requires, and this is one follow up with a lawyer, right? But at the same time, it's one where pretty much they want to know about every little thing that happens on the network. I think technically, if you read it by the letter of the law, if you even have a workstation that got infected by a piece of malware, they want to know about it. You can see there's a requirement for making sure you have an incident response program in place and that you're practicing it, right? You're running tabletop exercises like we talked about in the previous section, right? To go through, and we're running through the incident response plan now in that tabletop exercise where we can talk about it, sitting in a conference room where everybody's online. And we can walk through the scenarios. We can make sure we have the appropriate procedures documented. We can take the appropriate steps. We know who to call. We know about the backup out of band communication channels. We know, et cetera, et cetera. So that way, when a real incident occurs, we can respond. Because when a real incident occurs, especially in an OT environment, right, it's all about ensuring physical safety. And so when you think, especially in rail and commuter rail, right? We want to ensure the safety of all of our passengers and our employees. We also think of, not only from a physical safety perspective, but I always go to, it wasn't long ago, probably a year or so ago, where we had the train carrying toxic chemicals overturned in Lebanon in the United States. And I think it was Indiana. Don't quote me on that one. And when the train overturned, that huge toxic release, right? That mushroom cloud of toxic chemicals and the impact to the local environment and the general population that lives around that was horrible. So those are the things that we're trying to protect against in OT. Right? It just goes back to it's very different than what we're trying to protect in IT. And see, there's also requirements in the TSA Security Directives for vulnerability assessments, right? Understanding what vulnerabilities are in the environment, making sure that we're scanning the environment for vulnerabilities, finding those vulnerabilities, and not only finding them, but getting them fixed, ideally. And then conducting cybersecurity maturity assessments. So looking at the environment from different aspects. And usually there's 12, 13, 14 different aspects you can look at. When I do OT cybersecurity assessments for my clients outside of Floor, I have 20 different areas that we examine. And it's a prioritized list. So that way, when you look at the environment and you look for, we can see the strengths of the environment, but mostly we're looking for the opportunities for improvement. And then not only where we can see there's opportunities for improvement, but it's a prioritized list so you can understand, we have 100 different things to do to improve security. Well, where do we start? And that's the nice thing about having that prioritized list. Well, let's start at the top, right? This prioritize. Priority number one. And maybe we work on 1, 2, and 3 all at the same time. It just depends on the resources we have available. And we just keep on working down that list. So we're continually improving. Right? So continue to improve, continue to evolve. That's the key. Again, I keep stressing it, but I always see, especially when there's questions, you talk about compliance and audits, and people just, they want to pass the audit. They want to say they're compliant, and they'll just do the bare minimum to get there, which I think is travesty, right? It's because we're not putting our best foot forward. Right? As long as we have the resources, why aren't we improving? Now, I understand not every environment has the resources to do so, but make sure you do your best to obtain the resources to continually improve, even if it's little by little. That's all we can strive for at the end of the day. And that we'll wrap up part 9. So I know it's a little different section for us in the course, but I appreciate you listening in, staying tuned. Again, if you're at the end of part 9, you've come a long way. And we got one more part to come. I think the most fun part when we talk about penetration testing in control systems. So we're going to end on a high note, and then we'll actually have a final part. It's not necessarily a part to the core. I mean, it's not content. We're going to go over the review questions for the course. So for those of you that want to actually test your knowledge and see how well you do, we're actually going to go through the review questions. So there actually is going to be a part 11, believe it or not. So I think we'll end up hitting probably closer to 25 hours. So I'm excited. But in the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, you can reach out. Definitely ping me on LinkedIn, or you can find all my resources at mikeholcomb.com. If you like the video, if you don't mind liking on YouTube or subscribe, I appreciate that. Otherwise, I will see you back here for part 10. Thank you very much, and take care out there.